Joining me again this week, Scott Bauer from the Associated Press. Thanks so much for joining us here.
You bet.
All right, so I wanted to start by talking about the Trump indictment. Do you think, based on what you're hearing, that this will have any sort of impact on these state races, particularly that Supreme Court race this week?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The Supreme Court race, Trump has not been really directly tied to that race the way he was in the governor's race last year. He is not endorsed in this race. He did previously endorse Dan Kelly in 2020, but Dan Kelly has been, not saying he's not seeking Trump's endorsement, doesn't like to talk about Trump, hasn't been really, he's trying to distance himself from the previous work he did for Republicans. So in this race, you don't have a direct Trump connection the way you did in some other ones. So people are saying that they think it may motivate some, conservative voters to come out and vote if they feel like they can connect Dan Kelly and Donald Trump. But on the other hand, it may also motivate some Democratic voters to come out and vote because, as we know, the reaction to Trump is strong on both ends of the political spectrum. So folks I've talked with seem to think they don't think it's going to have a huge impact on this race. Normally when there's a late-breaking news event, it affects the candidate directly more than it would in a tertiary way like this one where Trump is not the actual person on the ballot.
Yeah, we'll see how this affects the 2024 races, obviously moving forward at a national level as well. So the election is Tuesday, and I know some people, the early voters, have looked at their ballot and said, what are these amendments? Let's kind of explain here. There's two amendments, both of them tied to cash bail, right?
Right. So there's two. There was one constitutional amendment proposal that passed the legislature, and they broke it up into two questions on the ballot. So they're both related to the same basic question, which is, can judges take into consideration more factors when setting cash bail for a defendant? And if they can, if you say yes to that, then can they look at past convictions of violent crime when setting that bail? And so on one hand, it's kind of confusing. On the other hand, it's pretty simple. Basically, it boils down to, can judges look at more factors than they do currently when setting bail? They don't have to. This would allow them to do that. A lot of voters probably think judges can already do that. Opponents of the amendment say that it will create all kinds of problems in the judicial system that's already overcrowded, already understaffed, and that just keeping people in jail longer on bail will have kind of a backup effect, and among other things.
And you mentioned this was pushed by the Republicans, but there was some bipartisan support when this was originally voted through, correct?
Right. There is bipartisan support for this. Democrats primarily make up the opponents, but there are some Democrats who supported it along with Republicans. And there's also a bill coming behind this, should it be adopted, to kind of clarify the language about what constitutes a violent crime. In that bill, we don't know where the governor stands on that yet. He would have the power to sign or veto that bill, but the constitutional amendment, the power of whether that gets adopted or not, rests solely with voters on Tuesday.
Yeah, and we should clarify, the governor cannot veto a constitutional amendment, right? So if this passes, it is law.
Correct.
And then meanwhile, you mentioned there's a bill. They're trying to clarify some of the language here in that amendment. This bill only takes effect if the amendment passes, right?
That's right, because it's some would say it's a trailer bill. I've heard it called a sunrise bill, where if something happens on Tuesday, if those get adopted, then this bill is coming up behind it to kind of lay the groundwork, put in more details about how this amendment would actually work.
And the governor you mentioned, he's been very quiet on that bill, right? So we're not actually sure what happens should that bill and the amendment become passed through, correct?
Right. So if the bill gets vetoed, then we're kind of back to square one in terms of trying to work out how this amendment is going to work in the real world.
This is a nonpartisan race here in the spring. This is usually not the type of election that draws this kind of attention. Do you recall ever seeing this level of anticipation for a race like this in a non-presidential and non-gubernatorial year?
I would say the one that comes to mind that had the most attention similar to this would be in 2011, when David Prosser was on the Supreme Court and he was running for another term, and we were just on the heels of Act 10. I mean, we were in the midst of Act 10 at that point, and he was on the ballot, and that was a very hotly contested race against Joanne Kloppenburg, and David Prosser won, and that was kind of a proxy battle for the Act 10 union fight. This election has kind of become a proxy battle over abortion rights, and in the post-Dobbs world of Roe v. Wade being overturned, you have kind of this battle between the candidates over that issue, among others.
It's never a dull day in your world, is it?
No, it isn't.
Never a dull day here in state politics. Thanks so much for talking about it here with us, Scott Bauer.
You bet.
Appreciate it.